From billionaires draining the blood of younger generations to others getting women pregnant just to harvest stem cells and extend their own lives, these are the dark, dangerous, and sometimes illegal ways the richest people alive are trying to cheat death. Starting with Peter Thiel, in 2016 a story started circulating around Silicon Valley that the billionaire, who co-founded PayPal and placed one of the earliest bets on Facebook, was getting fascinated by a practice called parabiosis, a practice concerning taking the blood of the young generations like babies or kids and putting it into older generations. The idea had come out of experiments where aging mice were stitched to younger ones so the two shared a single bloodstream, and the old mice seemed to perk up as though youth were something you could pipe in through a tube. And right around the same time, a company called Ambrosia had quietly begun offering exactly that to anyone who could afford it, charging thousands of dollars for infusions of plasma drawn from donors in their teens and 20s. Reports suggested Thiel was interested, and a few went further and hinted he'd tried it himself. Even though he flatly denied that, one thing is true, that Peter Thiel has for years said that death isn't some fixed law of nature. It's a problem, and problems can be fixed. Maybe what he's hinting at is becoming a true vampire. Then there's Sam Altman, the man at the head of OpenAI who in 2021 put serious money behind a company called Retro Biosciences with one simple, almost impossible promise to add roughly 10 healthy years to the human lifespan. Its scientists work on cellular reprogramming, on the way cells clean out their own waste, and on therapies inspired by that same young blood thread that keeps reappearing in these stories. And on paper, it sounds like progress, but this is where the trouble starts. A company like Retro lives under constant pressure to show results, to prove the science is working, and to keep the next round of funding flowing. And that pressure has a way of pushing unproven treatments out of the lab and into real human bodies long before anyone actually understands what they do over a lifetime. When the science is this new, the early volunteers become the experiment, and the long-term effects only reveal themselves years down the line, by which point they may be impossible to undo. And guess who these volunteers typically are? People with barely any money doing whatever it takes to make a living. And what's more, if Retro ever works, the first doses won't be cheap, and they won't be plentiful, which means it's the billionaires on top who will benefit and not the rest. Next up is Brian Johnson, who sold his payments company for around $800 million and pointed every cent of it at a single enemy, his own death. His program is called Blueprint. It runs him roughly $2 million a year, and it has turned his body into a laboratory that never closes. More than 30 doctors tracking his blood, his organs, his sleep, even his nighttime erections, all of it feeding a system that decides what he eats and when. But the moment that made the whole world stop and stare came in 2023. Johnson had his 17-year-old son hooked up to a machine, drew off the boy's blood plasma, and had it pumped into his own veins, then passed his own plasma down to his 70-year-old father. 3 generations of one family run through a tube in search of a few more years. And here's the part that should sit uneasily. Even if a teenage son says yes, can that yes ever really be free when your father is famous, rich, and building an entire immortality brand around the moment? The boy doesn't get to be a kid making a choice. He becomes a spare parts supplier for his own dad. Johnson eventually admitted the whole thing did nothing measurable and quietly dropped it, but by then the message was already out there that this is the future and that your children are part of the equipment. And then there's Jeffrey Epstein, who was a convicted sex offender. Released records and later reporting show he paid to have his entire DNA mapped out, and that he talked openly about extending his life, editing his own genes, and finding ways to repair the body as it aged. But it never stopped at simply staying alive. He kept returning to a much darker idea, the dream of building a better human race, including a reported fantasy of getting a large number of women pregnant so he could fill the world with his own bloodline. Other accounts said he wanted his head and his DNA frozen after death so that some version of him might one day be brought back. So in Epstein's case, the dream of living forever curdles into something far uglier than a longer life. It becomes the urge to control, to breed, to stamp himself onto the future. And there's one last lesson buried in it. Epstein used his money and his connections to push his way into serious scientific circles where he never belonged. And for years, people like Bill Gates let him in. Next is Jeff Bezos. In September 2021, word leaked that Bezos was quietly bankrolling a secretive new company, and on the 19th of January 2022, it finally stepped out of the shadows. It was called Altos Labs, and it launched with $3 billion in the bank, the most heavily funded biotech startup in history before it had sold a single thing. Its goal sounds like science fiction. Not slowing aging down, but actually reversing it, winding human cells backwards to a younger state using the same molecular trick that won a Nobel Prize. But here's the part that should make people uneasy. To build it, Altos went out and hired some of the most controversial scientists alive. One of them, Juan Carlos Espesua Belmonte, had just months earlier, in April 2021, helped create the first living things that were part human and part monkey. Tiny clusters of cells grown in a dish for 20 days at the very earliest stage of life. And because that kind of work slams straight into ethics laws across the West, much of it was carried out with labs in China, where the rules are looser. So this is what a billionaire's fortune actually buys. Not a wellness brand, but the freedom to chase the most extreme science on Earth, in whichever country asks the fewest questions. Lastly, we got Peter Nygaard, a Finnish-Canadian fashion mogul who, by 2014, was telling anyone who'd listen that he'd found a way to reverse aging. From a sprawling compound in the Bahamas, he filmed himself claiming that stem cell science was making him younger by the year, and he openly floated the idea of living forever. He hired scientists, poured money into a clinic, and even claimed he had helped shape the Bahamas' own stem cell laws so the work could go ahead, a claim the government flatly denied. For a while it looked like just another rich man's vanity project, but the real story, laid out years later in a string of lawsuits and a major television investigation, was far darker. Investigators alleged that Nygaard had deliberately gotten numerous women pregnant, paid for those pregnancies to be terminated, and then used the stem cells from them to try to extend his own life. In November 2023, a Canadian jury convicted Nygaard of sexually assaulting 4 women, some as young as 16, and in 2024, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison, with more charges, including sex trafficking, still waiting.